So I have 9 o'clock, so we're going to go ahead and get started because as you learned on the offer to purchase, time is of the essence, right? We got a lot to do in a short period of time, and I think that's why they call it Cram, so that you get everything crammed in a short period of time. So welcome to the Cram class. I'm Jane Bowser, one of the instructors at Carolina School of Real Estate. And the way that we work Cram classes is that your Cram class instructor is not your classroom instructor, so that you get like a different viewpoint of things like right before the test. And so it's not meant to confuse you or anything like that, but just to provide you with maybe some different explanations on things maybe you're having trouble with. And so that way you feel, you might go, oh, now that makes sense. I wish, so that's kind of why we do it like that. So welcome to the Cram course, and a little bit about me, just for those of you that don't know. In addition to being an instructor at Carolina School of Real Estate, I am a broker at Allen Tate, and I am dually affiliated, which you guys might know what that means, that you're not able to do that when you're a provisional broker. You have to be a full broker to do that. And I'm with Allen Tate in Boone and Blowing Rock and Allen Tate in Winston-Salem. So that way I just have one set of systems and everything to learn, but I'm able to be in 2 places because I split time between the 2 locations. And so Cram is my favorite thing to teach, and I like post and I like pre also, but I just love Cram. I don't know, it was my first one that I taught for Carolina School, and I've just always really enjoyed it. So a little bit about what we're going to do today. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about some test taking tips. And this comes from, I guess, my original background, which is education. I've taught for over 35 years now, I guess. And many years at High Point University, teaching people how to be teachers. And so they have to take certain tests in order to get their licenses. And many times what we found out was, it wasn't that they didn't know the content, it was that they didn't know how to take a test. And so we're going to go over some test-taking tips to kind of, the best of the best from all of those years of knowledge, ways to kind of look at the questions to help you be successful on them. And so we'll kind of take a look at that. Then I actually have a sample test that you're going to do. And the sample test you're going to do is from the state side. Okay, it's from the state side of things, because many of the topics that are the most problematic on the state side are also the most problematic on the national side. And we're talking about agency and financing, those types of things. And then we find that more people do not pass the state than mess up on the national. So we really try to emphasize the state, because there's this extra little piece on the state called Appendix A, License Law and Commission Rules. And there are a lot of questions that come from that. And if you're not up on that, then you tend to have an issue with the test. So that's kind of why we look at the state part. Now there's an extra added piece to the state part today, and that is some math questions, math review from the national section, because the national section is the only section that contains math problems. And so we're going to have some of those. Now, you may not have time to finish the entire state test and the math questions during the allotted time frame. I added the math questions in as an additional feature. Okay? And we do have some time scheduled up here for a math review, and we can include the math problems with that, or for the entire test, including the math, I have a copy of the answers and explanations for every one of them. So you'll be taking that home with you when you leave today. You'll take the practice test home, you'll take the answers home. One of the things you may want to do if you have a piece of paper is, rather than writing the answers on the test, write it on another piece of paper. Then you'll have these questions to go back and look at again without seeing what the answer is when you're reading them. So that's another good way, to practice. So we'll have that little sample test. Then we'll come back, we'll go over the answers to the test. I'm not going to give you out the answers until we go over the answers, right? So that we can kind of have some discussion with the answers and clarification of any misconceptions that you have. From that point on, we will have a key topic review. And these are the key things that are tested and or the key things that people tend to mess up on. That's kind of what our review is. And then we always include math because that also tends to be a trouble spot for people. So this is a tentative schedule of how much time we will spend on each one of these. When you're doing the test, if you finish early, go ahead and take your break. We may take a couple of short breaks, as we go through, but this will be like the fastest 4 hours of your life. It usually just flies by because we're really engaged in what it is that we're doing. So that's kind of how we're going to run things today. Any questions before we get started? Anybody? Ready to go? Alrighty. So test taking tips. Be prepared. Well, duh. You need to be prepared. But here's some things to keep in mind when you're doing that. Cramming the day before or the night before will not increase your score. There's tons of research that shows that does not increase your score. If you don't know the content the day before, you're not going to know the content by the day of the test, especially when it comes to real estate, because this is not memorization. This is mostly application and analysis. So there are a few things that are recall, right? But I bet if I told you right now, what's IRMA? Everybody could tell me IRMA, right? You know IRMA. So you got your recall stuff down. You don't need to be cramming that. What you need to be doing is practicing test questions every single day leading up to the test. Just a few every day. Doing some math every single day. Don't cram the night before. That will not help. Take a practice test or 2 or 3 or 4 or 1 every day. Just do questions every single day. That is the key thing. Because many times, what trips you up when you're doing these questions at the end of the chapter in the online system? The wording, right? They're very specific about the wording, and they'll change the word offer and contract and try to throw you off, right? Or they'll give you answers that are partially correct and then one that's totally correct, and you've got to choose the most correct one. So getting used to the way they ask the questions is very, very helpful. And so you'll see that in the text, but you also see some even more difficult questions in the online system that we have for you. Get a good night's sleep. Okay, you want to make sure that you're well rested, and that kind of goes with cramming. Staying up all night the night before to cram, not going to help you. Getting a good night's sleep, eating a good breakfast, those kinds of things are really going to help you. Don't come in at the last minute, because then you're going to be stressed about even arriving. Get there early, and if you're nervous, walk up and down the hall, bounce around. These are some of our stress relief techniques. If you just walk up and down the hall, kind of shake things out just a little bit. I can't shake too much now because I'm wired on the microphone. But you bounce around, you kind of shake things off, you burn up that adrenaline, that will help you. Okay. Another thing that will help you is just kind of practicing some deep breathing. Okay. If you get really nervous, you can take in a deep breath, hold it for a few seconds, and then just kind of let it go. That will kind of help to calm you down as well. Okay. Interesting thing that I used to teach before I taught university. I taught high school chemistry, and they had a test they had to pass at the end of the semester to get credit for the course. And one of the things that we did in that class every time was this thing called the crossover. And so you do this, and what it does is it gets the hemispheres of your brain working together. It fires those connections. So many times when people are recovering from strokes or recovering from things, or they have MS, they're doing that crossover technique because it gets your brain working with your body. So that's another thing. Also, believe it or not, research has been shown that peppermint improves your mental focus during a test. So get your Ricolas, get your peppermints, bring some of those for the test, and see if that helps you. Okay? Even when you take the computer test, you can have a cough drop in or whatever when you walk in to take the test. And then if you take a little break in between the 2 sections to go to the bathroom, right, I think they'll let you have your little stash of cough drops right out there, or your peppermint right out there, and they'll let you put one in before you go back in. All right? So you may want to give that a whirl if peppermint tends to work for you. Okay? So those are just a few of just general stress reduction techniques that have been 100% all research-based. Okay? So they've all been proven to be effective from what research says. Alrighty, as soon as you get your test booklet, if there's something that you're afraid you're going to forget, like 1/2 parentheses base times height, or 43,560, if you're afraid you're going to forget something, as soon as you get that test booklet, write it down. When you're taking the computer test, as soon as you go in, you'll have scrap paper. As soon as you walk into that room, they turn you loose, write it down. then you won't have to worry about it. Okay, so you want to do that. Budget your time. Okay, now some students on the paper test will do the math first to get it out of the way. Some will flip over and do the state part first to get it out of the way, and then do the national. And some of those things have been shown to be effective. My advice, though, is, and you can do it in any order that you want, my advice is to do the national and then do the state, because that's the way you're going to see it on the computerized test. They don't let you jump back and forth between the two on the computer. You take the whole national part, right? Then you click submit. Then you take the state part. Then you click submit. Then you get a survey, which is like the most stress-inducing thing ever, because you're having to answer these questions, and you know just as soon as you click submit on that survey, they're going to tell you if you passed or not, right? I can't even remember what I answered on those things, but I do remember my heart rate probably tripled during the course of that little survey. But that's the way it works. That's the way it works. So you may want to, I would advise you to take the classroom test the same way that test is going to be, just so you're getting the experience for that. Okay? Don't second guess yourself too much. All right? If there's something that you're not certain of, mark it, come back to it, but don't agonize over it. Okay? The most important questions to mark, especially on that computer test, are like the first 3 or 4. Because you're sitting down, the test is starting, your adrenaline's high, your heart's racing, and you'll read the question, you'll go, oh my gosh, I don't know anything, right? It's just because you're nervous, okay? So you don't want to miss the first 2 or 3 questions just because you're nervous. So always mark those, okay? Go back, look at them later, and you'll probably go, oh my gosh, that was the easiest question on the test. But when you first see it and you're nervous, you kind of freak out just a little bit. So that's another helpful hint about that. And you are able to mark questions on the computer test to go back and review, just like you can mark questions on your book when you're taking the in-class test in your little test booklet and go back and review. Okay? So that's another helpful thing to do. Don't stress over individual questions. If there's one that you don't know, you can always do what Gomer Pyle did. You can just hit your 4 fingers, on the desk and figure out which one tingles the most, put that down and move on, right? So if you really have no clue, don't obsess over the fact you don't know one question, because nobody makes 100, right? It's very difficult to make 100. But if you only miss one, you're going to pass. So don't agonize over one. Don't let that 1 or 2 questions kind of keep you from the end goal, okay? So those are just some things to kind of keep in mind as you're going through. Because I've had people that will spend an hour on one question just agonizing over it, and then they've lost a bunch of their time. And so you don't want to do that. All right, when you're breaking down a test question, one of the things that you want to do, and we need a bigger screen, but is that you read the last sentence first. Read what they're asking you first. Because some of your questions are going to be like this long. There's a whole big long scenario, right? So you read the scenario, then you get to what they want to know, and you're like, oh, now I got to go read the scenario again, because now I know what it is we're looking for. So read that first. Now, a kind of enhanced version of that is to read that, look at your answers, then go back and read the scenario. And as you're reading the scenario, mark things that are important, or mark through things that are distractors. You kind of want to do that as well, okay? Now, on the computer test, of course, you can't mark through things because it's on a computer, but you've got scrap paper, and you can write down the important things, okay? And so that's another way to get prepared for that computer test. Look for distractors, okay? Look for distractors, because they're going to be there. They're going to tell you it's a 7% loan for 30 years, and you're not going to need to know that in the question. They're going to give you the city tax rate, and the house is only in the county, right? They're going to throw in distractors to kind of throw you off to make sure you know your stuff. So be looking for them, and go ahead and mark them so they don't trip you up. Draw things out. Draw things out. When you're talking about when a contract is formed, right? Think about that. You know that you've got your buyer and your buyer's agent, you've got your seller and your seller's agent, and you know that it's got to go back across the other side for acceptance, right? And so if you need to, draw a line and put them up there, and as you're reading the question, put which side it's on. Count with your fingers if you need to when you're doing the math. Do that. Do whatever you need to help. Those things will be very helpful. Okay? When you're looking at the answers, mark through the ones that are wrong. 2 of them are usually pretty ridiculous, right? You know that 2 of them are wrong, and then 2 of them are there to throw you off. One of them's going to be partially right. One of them's going to be totally right. And so mark through the ones that are wrong. Okay? And remember, when you're doing those all of the above except, or everything is true except, or which one is false, you treat each one as a true false. 3 of them are going to match. One of them's not going to match, and that's going to be your answer. Right? So keep that in mind as you're going through those kinds of questions. Read very carefully the words, because you're going to see may and you're going to see must. And there's a big difference between may and must. So if they say, you may be able to be paid for things you did when you were active after you've gone inactive, that's a lot different than you must not be paid or you must be paid for things that you did. Because must is not accurate in that scenario. Because even if the law says or the rule says it's okay as long as you're not practicing after you go inactive, your company policy may say you can't be. Right? So know that difference between may and must. And then watch out for except. Watch out for that except. When you see except, go into true-false mode. Right? Go into true-false mode. And then remember that rarely is something always. Rarely is something always. So if they give you a definitive thing, always, must, then take pause with that and look and make sure that's the answer before you choose that one. Okay? It's not to say that there can't be a situation where always isn't the right answer, but if you see that, they might be trying to trip you up. All right, so any questions about kind of how you break down a question on a test? Anything? Okay, so let's do a practice one. Let's figure out what the answer to this question is. Do we have a thought in our mind yet? So let's look at the question. Okay. Nancy and Bill are married and they own their own home. Nancy's concerned about her son, or I could say their son, being able to afford a home of his own. So in her will, she leaves him $20,000 in her share of the home. After Nancy dies, how do her husband and her son own the property? Who has an idea? What do you think it is in the back?
Her husband owns it. Her son has no ownership. That's his entirety.
Exactly.
Her son only gets the $20,000.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Did everybody get that one? Did that trip anybody up? Okay, so that's good. So right here, this is testing your knowledge of tenancy by the entireties. Right? That's what the question is testing. And it's also testing, can a will trump tenancy by the entireties? No, it cannot. Tenancy by the entireties trumps it all. All right? Now, if the two of them together wanted this to occur, how would they have had to have taken title of that property? The tenants in common. They would have had to. And can you do that when you're married? Yes. If you specify you want to take title as tenants in common, you're allowed to, right? But if you don't specify, you'll be taking title as tenancy by the entireties. Yes, ma'am?
If you buy the house before you're married,
yes.
how is that situation?
If you buy the house before you're married, you have to buy it as tenants in common, because tenants by the entireties is only for people that are married. Okay? It does not automatically convert, right? If you want to change it after you get married, you must go and have an attorney change it. Okay? And think about this logically. One, it would be an organizational nightmare to keep up with that and automatically flip it over. And two, no attorney is going to do that work without being paid.
Okay, so if that question said Nancy and Bill bought the house before they got married, then
Right.
the answer would be the husband
That's right.
and son own it as tenants in common?
Exactly. Because unless they specify something special, you go with what the default is. So the default before you're married, tenants in common. Even if you're engaged and getting ready to be married, if you have not yet put the ring on the finger, it's tenants in common. Okay? And then after you're married, unless it specifies, it's tenancy by the entireties. Okay? So they might be testing your knowledge of the commonality of that. All right? So that was very good. Everybody did well with that. Okay. So, and we'll talk about taking ownership of things again, because that's one of the things that people mess up, is that joint tenancy and tenancy in common and tenancy by the entirety. So that'll be one of our problem topics. So we'll hit this again. All right, so any questions before we do our little practice examination? Okay, so again, this is, my advice to you is to write the answers on another piece of paper, and I think some people might have some scrap paper if you need some to be able to share, just so you can go back and take this test again and not have the answers already circled. Okay, so the exam review. First thing, we're going to talk about our little tendencies here, right? Because they're going to ask you this. They're definitely going to ask you about tendency. Tendency in common, tendency in severalty, joint tendency with right of survivorship, and tendency by the entirety. So you're definitely going to be asked about that. We talked a little bit about it at the beginning, right, when we were doing our review, before we did our little practice test. So, things to remember. Joint tendency with right of survivorship. Is that a favored form of ownership in North Carolina? No, it's not. Okay? And for test purposes, joint tenancy will have right of survivorship. In North Carolina, you have to specifically say that you've got right of survivorship. So if we have our little people here, so we've purchased our piece of property. Oh, it's a brand new whiteboard. That's so awesome. And there are some people that have bought this property together, right? We've got A here. Oh, this should be equal. I need to draw a peace sign, right? There we go. A, B, and C. Okay? So they have purchased this, and when they've purchased this together, right, what happens if C gets mad and decides to sell to D? How does D now own the property with A and B? Tenants in common. So these two still have joint tenancy with right of survivorship. This person has tenants in common. Okay? Now let's say that, so C's out of the picture. A dies. How do B and D own it? Tenants in common. Okay? So good. So just wanted to make sure you remembered that. And we talked pretty much in detail about tenants in common versus tenancy by the entireties. Right? So I think we're probably pretty good on that. Any questions about any of the ownership types?
Just make sure joint tenancy, right of survivorship is not really used in North Carolina.
It's not a favored form of ownership in North Carolina. However, one of the very first closings I ever had, there was joint tenancy with right of survivorship on a deed for a lot. The two sisters had bought the lot that way, and then one of the sisters owned a house and a lot herself, but she owned the second lot with her sister's joint tenancy with right of survivorship. So when they got ready to sell, when the lady got ready to sell, she wanted to sell both things. Okay? So what do you think she did to make it easier to sell both pieces of property together as one? She had her sister do a quitclaim deed of that lot over to her. So now she owned everything, and we could list it in the MLS as one property with one seller, and they just figured out how they were going to split the proceeds themselves. Okay? So that's my experience with a real joint tenancy with right of survivorship. So it does exist in North Carolina. That's an example of when it would exist. Okay? And so remember, they like to ask you, if you're engaged and you buy this tenancy in common, how do you hold it after you get married? Tenants in common, unless you come and you tell them to change it, right? Yes, ma'am.
We were discussing the one tenancy in common. You can't specify percentages, or is it joint? You can't specify.
Yeah. So tenants in common, you can. They don't have to be equal percentages. Joint tenancy, you typically take it with unified time and possession. Okay, those types of things. You have to buy it at the same time, and that type of thing. So that's what you're talking about with joint tenancy. Tenants in common, you could be 95 and 5. I had one like that with my first husband and his brother. His brother had taken care of their mother. So when she died, she left 2/3 of the house to him and 1/3 to my husband. Okay. Then when my husband died, he left his part to his children, okay, because they were tenants in common, right? So he left it to them. And then the brother eventually bought them out, and then he owned it in severalty. So that's kind of how that chain might work.
I have a question. So if my husband purchased property before we were married, once we're married, we are now tenants entirely?
No, no. He is tenant. No. If he bought it by himself before you were married, no, you're not on the deed.
If we bought it together before we were married?
If you bought it together before you're married, it's tenants in common, unless you went to the attorney and had them change it. Okay? Cool with that? All right. Fixtures. Remember Irma, your good buddy Irma? All right. So they like to test you about understanding Irma. They may ask you what's the most important, which would be intent. Okay? Or they may give you a scenario and ask you if something is a fixture or not. So one of the examples that we like to talk about is shutters versus drapes. Shutters are permanently affixed, right? So they're fixtures. The drapes you could take with you. You got to leave the curtain rods and things like that, but you could take the curtains with you, right? So be thinking about that. Now, when you have a trade fixture, then what happens with that? That's a little bit different, right? What happens with that? Anybody remember? Can somebody tell us a little bit about trade fixtures? Go ahead.
So it's for commercial property, and the tenant can take it with them as long as they take it before the lease.
Before the lease expires. Exactly. Okay. What about if it's a farm, a ground lease, and they built a big fence? Can they take that with them? No. Okay. So that's become a part of the property. All right. Any questions about Irma? People feel good about Irma? Question about Irma? Hot tub.
Yeah, there was a question on there that was one of the tests.
Hot tub is a fixture.
Yeah. So when you think about it, because it's been installed, okay, it's been connected to water, it's been that kind of thing. That's a fixture.
But a washer and dryer, okay.
Well, yeah. Washer and dryer typically are not, because it's very easy. It's kind of like if you have one of those blow-up kiddie pools, not a fixture. All right, hot tub a fixture. But with a hot tub, lots of times people want to take their hot tub with them. So as long as they specify they're taking the hot tub with them, then you can take it with them. Now, if they say that, but they don't put it in the contract, because that's what they're going to ask you, right?
That's the question.
Yeah, if they say it, they're taking it with it, but it's not in the contract, can they take it with them? No, must be in the contract. Okay? All righty. Old car. You've got to know your old car. Okay. So, what they like to ask you about with regard to old car is some scenario related to your responsibility, like it might be about accounting, or maybe about disclosure, or obedience, or something like that. Like obedience as long as they're following the law. Right? Because you can't be obedient to your client if what they're doing is illegal. So law trumps old car. Okay. Another thing that you need to know is that you owe the customer honesty, fairness, and full disclosure of material facts. That's a potential test question. Right? They'll throw in one of the old cars here, and then they'll have these and say, which one do you not owe the customer? Okay? So make sure you know you always owe your customer honesty, fairness, and a full disclosure of material facts. That's the person on the other side. If you're the listing agent, that's like the buyer. Right? And what do they owe you? They owe you good faith and hopefully compensation, right? When would they not owe you compensation? That's one of them. When would they not owe you compensation? For sale by owner? Yes. So, let's think about this. Let's look at so if you have an exclusive right to sale listing agreement, you get paid no matter what. If it's an exclusive, but not exclusive right to sale, but exclusive agency, then you get paid unless what? Yeah, the buyer sells it themselves, right? And then that's when you would not get compensation. And if it's an open listing, then the first person to sell it gets the compensation unless the owner sells it himself, and then again, no compensation. So typically there's compensation, but not always. All right? So it's good to know when there might not be compensation. That's why it's in bold there, just so that you kind of remember that there are scenarios where you might not have compensation. Okay? Material facts. The material facts. There will be questions about material facts. Now, when it comes to material facts, you have your little book, License Law and Commission Rules, all right? Or if you look in Appendix A, if you look in Appendix A starting on page 710 and running through like 715, around that part, 715, 716, there are examples of times when people did not disclose material facts, misrepresentations, and things like that. We're getting ready to talk about that in just a minute. But look at that, because if they went to the trouble to create words and examples, they might go to the trouble to use those as their test questions, or scenarios from those, or things like that as their test questions. Okay? So keep that in mind. So material facts, things that are important to the sale. Okay? Radon, you got to know about radon. What's the cutoff limit for radon? We may talk about this later, but what's the cutoff limit for radon? 4 picocuries. And if you have too much radon, I mean, consistently, what does it cause? Lung cancer. Yes, it causes lung cancer. Okay. Lead paint, what's the year for that? 78. Yeah, built before 1978. 1978. Of course, a leaking roof should be a material fact. Termite damage, easements, zoning, water in the basement, if the house was a meth lab. Okay. Remember, those are your material facts. Things that are not material facts. If a previous owner had HIV, if there was a murder or a murder-suicide in the house, that is not a material fact. Okay. If somebody died in the house, if Casper the Friendly Ghost lives in the house, if Casper's mean brothers live in the house, or uncles, or whoever it was. All right? The demographics of the neighborhood, not a material fact. What about if Fluffy and Muffy are buried in the backyard? Is that a material fact? No. What if Grandma's buried in the backyard?
Probably.
Yes, yes. If there is a graveyard in the backyard, if there's a human grave in the backyard, or the ashes have been, that's a material fact. But if it's just the kitty, the puppy, or whatever, that is not a material fact. Okay? So just remember that. All right. Now we're getting to our misrepresentation and omission, because that's usually where they happen. They happen with regard to material facts. So with misrepresentation is done with words, and anybody can commit it. Okay? Anybody can say the wrong words. Omission, on the other hand, can only be committed by a broker. And that's when things are omitted without, or you forget the words. You don't say the words. They're without words. Why can only a broker commit omission? This is a high-level question here. What? Well, you're supposed to be aware, but why can the seller not commit omission? What?
The form that you
Right. So there's a form called the RPODES, Residential Property Disclosure. Right? Remember that form, the RPODES? What can the seller check the whole way down? Yeah. Yeah. No representation. So they can omit. They can omit. All right? They can omit. So that only a broker can be convicted of that. All right? So if it's willful, it means that you did it on purpose. You were trying to lie. You were trying, or you were trying to hide the truth in some way, shape, or form. If it's negligent, it was accidental, without knowledge. Okay? Like, example of that, well, we'll see some examples. But an example of negligent is you're typing the number in the MLS, and you type 4340, and it's supposed to be 4430. You just had a typo. That's negligent. You weren't trying to lie about the square footage. But it was still a problem, but it was negligent. Okay? And the broker must disclose, if they know, okay, even if the seller tells them not to do so. All right? Even if the seller tells them not to do so. Okay, so we have types here. Willful misrepresentation, negligent misrepresentation, willful omission, negligent omission, making false promises, and then puffing. So let's do an example of this. What do you think? Okay. What is this? Willful misrepresentation. Okay, great. That's willful misrepresentation. Awesome. Let's look at another scenario. See what you think this one is. All right, what is this one? Negligent misrepresentation. Exactly, exactly. Okay. Now, how would it have been willful misrepresentation? If they knew that it didn't perk and they said that it did. Okay. All right, what about this one? So, did they say something? No. So if they didn't say something, then it is omission. It's omission. And they did it on purpose. All right, so it becomes willful omission. What? Willful. It was on purpose. You got it. Yes. Yes. Okay. What's this one? False promises. So that one is false promises. Okay. And what's an example of puffing? Who has a good example of puffing? Best view in town, right? So the next thing you need to know is who needs a license. All right, they are definitely going to ask you that question: who needs a license? You're going to have something about that, and it is the LL Beans, right? Remember LL Beans? List, leases, buys, exchanges, auctions, negotiates, or sells. But the key thing is real property for others for compensation. Okay, so remember that. You got to have those things in there. It's got to be one of these things for others for compensation. So the question typically asks who needs or does not need a license and provides you with options. For example, someone serving as a power of attorney does not have to have a license to sell property for that person for whom they are power of attorney. Right? That's an example of the way that they might ask that question. Okay? Another way to think about this is, and what sometimes people get confused with, is when we're thinking about entity owners. Like you work for an entity, and the entity is doing one of these LL Beans things with its own properties. Do you have to have a license then? No, because if it's the entity's property, that's kind of the same thing as a for sale by owner, right? So think about that like that. If it's the entity's own property, it's like a for sale by owner. So that's a way to kind of remember that, and an easy way to remember that. Any questions about this? So they'll ask you about like the W-2 employee, what they can and cannot do, or what this person can and cannot do. And there'll be a few questions like that, but that's generally the way that they take that. So is everybody clear on that? Does anybody have any questions about that? So a W-2 employee working for an entity that is doing things with its own properties that it owns can do stuff without a license. Okay. Another way to think about that is a W-2 employee working for like a broker that does not have a license. What can they do? Can they go stick a sign in the yard? Yes. Can they schedule an appointment? Yes. Can they hold an open house? No. That kind of thing. Because they don't have a license, right? So they cannot go hold the open house. Can they go with you to the open house and sit there and write down people's names and phone numbers? Absolutely. Can they schedule the appraisal? Yeah. Can they schedule the inspection? Yeah. Can they show up in your place for the inspection? No. Exactly. Administrative duties. They can put things in the MLS that you've created and they're just being your secretary. They can submit an ad that you've written, but they can't do it themselves. Right? So they're basically doing administrative duties.
So a builder, someone's selling their property, has to have a real estate license.
If you're selling your own property, no, and you own it.
But if a builder has an open house and they have an agent, that would be a licensed agent in there.
So yeah, if it's like a model
Yes.
community and there's people in there in the model community, they are now agents. Yes, yes. They won't get quite that technical on it. Okay. So types of agents, you need to know this. You need to know that a universal agent is the power of attorney. They can perform all of the duties as if they were that person. Okay, so remember that. General agent, the most common general agent example we have is a what? Property manager. I heard somebody say that, a property manager. But you are a general agent for your firm. Right? You're able to sign things on behalf of the firm. Okay, so that makes you a general agent. And then this is the, but you're really 007, right? You're a special agent for your client, either the listing agent or the buyer's agent. Okay, so you're acting in that limited capacity for the purpose of the transaction. And then a subagent is just an agent working for an agent. Okay? So think about it. Your firm is who contracts with the client, so everybody in the firm becomes a subagent. Okay? And that's about as detailed as you need to get about that. Because if we get into subagency too much, everybody's brain will explode. Right? And so there's typically not a lot of stuff on subagency. They're going to be hammering you on dual designated, undisclosed dual, all those kinds of things. Okay? So those are much more important for you to focus on than the odd scenario of somebody, at another firm being a subagent to the firm that's actually got the listing. Okay. Broker comparison. So if you're a PB, you got to pass this class. You got to pass the exam. Your license is valid only when you were supervised by a BIC. So when you first get your license, it's what? Inactive. Right? It's when you affiliate with a BIC, they fill out the form, they send it in, you're affiliated, and you become active. Okay? You must complete 3 30-hour post-licensing classes by your 3-year license anniversary. So it's license anniversary. Okay? 1 each year, at least, in order to stay active. But starting July 1st of 2020, not grandfathered in, you have to have all 3 done by the 18-month anniversary of your license anniversary. So knowing that it's the license anniversary is important here because everything else is either June 10th or June 30th. Right? And so they might want to trip you up by saying, do you have to have your post-licensing done by June 10th of your 2nd year or something like that? And so you need to know license anniversary versus June 10th versus the 30th. Sir?
And for the test purposes, it's 3-year anniversary.
Right. This has not yet taken effect. So they won't change the test until the law actually goes into effect. Okay? They shouldn't change the test till the law goes into effect. But if you know both answers, you're covered, right? Alrighty. So the next thing is you do not have to complete continuing ed until you've renewed your license 1 time. Once you've renewed your license 1 time, you have to do continuing ed. So that'll be like your 2nd year. So for you guys, you don't really get, it's like yours didn't even happen, right? Because you're getting your license, let's say you get your license in March or April, okay, depending upon which class you're in. You get it in March or April, and then your first renewal comes up in June. Then you got to do your CE. Now, if you had gotten your license, last July, you would have had that whole year not having to do CE, and then you'd still be getting the CE the same time you guys are. So there's all about that timing. Okay, so after you've paid your renewal 1 time, then you have to do your CE. All right? You can do a CMA for a client because that's part of your job, but you can't do one for a fee. Okay, it can only be for your client. And you cannot be a designated agent against the BIC. Can you be a designated agent? Yes. Can the BIC be a designated agent? Yes, just not against each other. Okay? We'll contrast that by a full broker. A full broker does not have to be supervised by a BIC, okay, once they've reached BIC eligible status and things like that, right? But they don't have to be. They still work many times in a firm with a BIC, but the BIC isn't supervising every little thing that they do. They go to the BIC when they need help or they want to blame somebody for something. I'm sorry, my BIC told me the commission was 6%, right? He won't budge. You must complete your CE each year by June the 10th. It's always 8 units. There's the Gen Up, which is 4, and there's an elective, which is 4. Gen Up must be done face-to-face. Electives can be done online as of right now. Okay. Online electives, you have to take tests with them. If you go to an elective face-to-face, you just have to breathe. Inhale, exhale for the 4 hours that you're there, not miss too much time, and you're good with that. You renew by June 30th. The renewal starts May 15th through June 30th, or you go from current to expired. Current to expired. Okay. Does that make sense? Any questions about PB versus broker?
How do you know what continuing education you're supposed to be?
So you always have to take the general update. That's the update of all the rules that changed for the coming year. And then you get to pick.
Released like once a year or something, so you know that that's what your general update is?
So the general update, yeah, so I took my general update the first week it was offered, which was like this July 7th or something like that. And it was me and a whole bunch of people that forgot to get their CE. But I wanted to have it then, one, because the person that was teaching it, she's awesome. And another one because, well, it makes sense to me that if it's for all the rules that started July 1, you should take it in July. What a lot of people do, though, is they end up taking it in June. So it's only good for like 3 weeks. The Gen Up, the new rules are only good for 3 weeks. Then more new ones come out, right? So it's always the Gen Up. And then you get to pick your elective. And every so many years it has to be ethics. You have to do an ethics class. But other than that, you get to pick it. And there's some, they have interesting names like agency versus agony. That's just the name of one of them. I've seen one I thought was really good on doing square footage. That would be a very useful one. But they're all different kinds. And Carolina School of Real Estate offers a bunch of them. And the way we offer them typically, Gen Up in the morning, elective in the afternoon, lunch in the middle, and we provide the lunch. So it's an easy and a discount for doing both. It's an easy way to get them done. The BIC. Remember, provisional, broker, full broker, broker in charge are statuses. They're not separate licenses. Okay, sometimes I like to ask you about that. To be BIC eligible, which is broker in charge eligible, you have to have been active for 2 of the last 5 years. That's full-time. Full-time 2 of the last 5, part-time 4 of the last 5. You must complete the BIC course within 120 days of becoming a BIC or within the previous year. Okay? So you go take the 12-hour BIC course within 120 days of becoming a BIC or sometime within the past year before they name you a BIC. Okay? And then your CE is just like for a full broker, except instead of taking the Gen Up, the general update, you take the BIC Up, the BIC update. Okay? And if you're a broker, can you take the BIC Up? No, you must be a broker in charge or broker in charge eligible to take the BIC Up. I know I asked that question because I thought, well, cool, I'd like to take that because I think that might be like more, more stuff. No, you cannot do that.
What did you say that they would like to ask us in the beginning when you started on the slide?
Oh, that it's a status, not a separate license. It's a status, not a separate license. Okay. So you can only be the BIC of one location. So like Allen Tate has a location on Haynes Mall Boulevard, and they have a location on Vest Mill. They're literally like about a mile away. They have to have 2 separate BICs. Okay? 1 BIC per location, but you can do multiple things in that office. So you could do brokerage and property management in the same location and only have 1 BIC. All right? So it's per location, not necessarily per specialty. Right? You must display the BIC's license and the firm license at the firm office. That's what the BIC does. Okay? They maintain the trust account. They're responsible for all advertising. And they supervise all the provisional brokers. Okay? So they're responsible for active licenses, agency, advertising, the trust account, and maintaining transaction records. So in post, you'll earn 3 A's and 2 T's. Right? The 3 A's, active licenses, agency, advertising, and then trust account and transactions are the 2 T's, and then they supervise all the PBs. Okay? So that's your BIC. The commission, the commission's going to ask you something about themselves on the test, right? Of course they are. 9 members, 7 are appointed by the governor, okay, and 2 are appointed by the General Assembly. 1 by the President Pro Tem of the Senate, 1 by the House Speaker of the House. 3 must be licensed brokers. 2 cannot have anything to do with real estate or appraising. They cannot fine you. What can they do to you? Censure, reprimand, suspend, revoke. Those 4 things. You need to know those 4 things. They cannot fine you. They can only fine who? Timeshare developer. How much? $500 per offense. $500 per offense. Okay? Yes, censure, reprimand, suspend, and revoke. Censure, reprimand, suspend, and revoke. Don't really see a lot of censures much anymore. Mostly you see reprimand, suspend, and revoke. Real estate jail. That's AKA real estate jail. Right? There's not like a real physical place that they put you. They cannot practice law. They cannot declare contracts void. They can't regulate your commissions. They can't draft or require specific forms. They can't order you to reimburse trust funds, and they cannot compensate buyers or sellers for losses. The only people they can do money stuff with is timeshare developers. And so you know the timeshare thing must have been really wigged out for the commission to actually be able to find timeshare developers now. Okay. So how do you stay active? You exercise every morning, right? You stay active. Okay. So the way that you stay active is you complete your CE by June 10th, beginning with your 2nd year. It's just like a review here. You complete your post-licensing. Now we know it's the 3 years, but practically for you guys, you got to have it 18 months from your anniversary. But for test purposes, 1 class per anniversary year for each of the next 3 years. That's good until July 1 of 2020, and it's not grandfathered in. So everybody goes to the 18 months. So let's say that you got your license 18 months ago in June. You got to have it done before that July 1. There's no grandfathering in. That's okay. So you need to know that for yourself. If you don't pay your renewal fee, your license is expired. If it's expired 6 months, then it's an additional $45 to reinstate. I think there's a typo in that. Oh, there's a what is it called? Negligent misrepresentation there. It says 55. It's supposed to say 45. There's a typo. Inactive licenses. PB is not supervised by a BICR inactive. You're still subject to disciplinary action by the commission. Because if you're inactive and you're doing things that you should be active for, they can still discipline you. You still have to pay your annual renewal fee by the 30th if you're inactive. You don't have to take CE, but you may be subject to up to 16 units of CE to become active again, depending upon how long you've been inactive. And they'll also probably throw in a couple of post-licensing classes with that. Okay. Agency. A lot of the test is agency. Okay. So, listing agent agreement must be in writing from the start. Must be in writing from the start. Buyer agency, it can be oral initially, and that's typically what I do, especially in Boone. People are coming up from Florida, they don't know me from Adam's House Cat. You think they're going to sign an agreement with me the first time they meet me? Probably not. So we go oral agency until it's time to present that offer. We reduce it to writing, okay, before the offer. So they sign the agency agreement, then they sign the offer. So if you're using zip forms, do them in order. Don't let them sign the offer first and then the agency agreement, because somebody can get real picky and notice that the times are off. Okay. What are the types of listing agreements? Exclusive right to sell. That's where you get paid no matter what. Exclusive agency we talked about. The owner can sell without paying commission. A non-exclusive listing, the agent competes against other agents and the owner for commission. That's kind of like your open listing. Or maybe you could just give them some services. Maybe they just want to pay you to do a CMA, which you can't do when you're a PB, but you can do when you're a full broker. Right? So there could be some limited services there. On the buyer's agency side, okay, again, it must be in writing by the time you present the offer. Exclusive buyer agency, if you want to limit them, it's got to be in writing from the start. Okay? And this is another important thing. The buyer owes you commission if not covered by the listing agent. Okay? So if you're doing it for sale by owner, one of the reasons that, you've got your client wants to buy for sale by owner, you call that owner and you say, hey, I've got a client interested. Will you compensate me? If they say no, your buyer has to compensate you. It's part of the agreement. You probably need to remind them of that. It's in writing and they signed it, but they don't think about it. Okay, so remind them of that so they don't get mad at you, right? Types of agency. Again, trouble topic on the test. Single agency is the most common. You're representing a buyer or you're representing a seller, and your firm is. And then the other side is done by a different firm, right? So I've got a listing, I'm Alan Tate, the buyer comes from Leonard Ryden and Burr, that's two firms, that's single agency, two agents. That's what normally happens.
It's like, two different locations for the same, like, company.
Oh, that's an interesting one. Two different
Like the
Yeah.
Coldwell Banker in Kernersville, Coldwell Banker in Winston-Salem.
Those are not two different firms. They're two different locations.
So is it
Different locations. So that's a good question. I have to check about I would not consider that to be, I would consider that to be single agency. Because you're thinking about Alan Tate in Greensboro and Alan Tate in Winston-Salem.
Yeah.
Those are two different firms.
Okay.
Okay, those are
So
two
is
different
it
firms.
possible for one firm to have two different locations?
Yes, it is possible for a firm to have two different locations.
Okay. But they're not going to ask us that on the test.
They're not going to ask you that on the test. No, they are not going to get that technical on the test. They will not. You will not have to know that. Everybody will be going, oh my gosh, no. Thank goodness that will not be on the test. Okay, good question, but thank goodness that will not be on the test. All right, so dual agency. Undisclosed dual agency is illegal. That's what we were talking about earlier with one of our test questions, right? So with dual agency, the firm and the agent represent both the buyer and the seller. Okay, so the way that this can happen is, I'm the firm. Let's just say I'm Alan Tate. Okay, here's Alan Tate's the firm, and here's my friend over here, Yako. He's got a listing. Okay, and then here I am over here. I've got the buyer. Okay, if we're both in the same firm, that's dual. Okay. Now, our firm practices designated, which is a feature for your clients. So then, if our firm practices designated, then this becomes dual designated. If the firm doesn't practice designated, then it's dual. Make sense?
Does it automatically become designated, or?
If your firm practices designated, then yes, it's designated. If the firm does not practice designated, then it stays dual. Okay? All right. So, let's change this around a little bit. I've got a listing. Okay? I've also got a buyer out here. And my buyer says, hey, you know what? I think I'd like to see your listing. What's that? What kind of agency is that? That's dual. That's always dual. Okay? So you can, even if your firm practice is designated, you could still have just dual. All right. Cool. So we're good with that. Awesome. If you're in dual, you can only disclose material facts. Remember that. You cannot give them advice about pricing or anything at all. And you must have consent of both the buyer and the seller in writing to do dual agency by the time you're going under contract. Okay? And then designated is the same time, same kind of criteria, special type of dual. Designated agents, we just saw that on our little chart over here, but you also must have that consent in writing. There are little places that they sign on the listing agreement, on the buyer agency agreement, and on the contract. Okay? I mean, on the two agency agreements, sorry, the two agency agreements where they say that they allow that. It's not on the contract, it's on the agency agreements. They started making noise out here, and it started getting my mouth. I started listening to that, and words just came out of my mouth. Remember, agency disclosure, first substantial contact, working with real estate agents brochure. Okay, that's whenever you start to talk about price, terms, motivation. Okay. If representing a buyer, you must disclose to the seller or seller's agent at initial contact.
I'm confused about that. We talked about that earlier.
Right.
You said it was just for the agent.
That's right. So if I'm representing a buyer, I must disclose to the seller or the seller's agent, the other side,
Right.
that I'm representing someone.
So if you're representing, that was a question. We talked about that earlier, and you said if it was agent to agent, then
Correct.
at initial
So if I'm calling the agent, or if I'm calling a for sale by owner,
Yeah.
right? First thing I have to tell them is that I'm a real estate agent with the firm representing a client. Okay, so that they don't know that I'm just somebody out there asking a question. Because if they don't know that I'm representing somebody else, they may accidentally tell me something they wouldn't want me to tell my client.
Okay, so if you're representing the seller, and you're talking to a buyer, you don't have to disclose that initial contact.
You always disclose initial contact to the other side. Always disclose to the other side.
There's a question in here.
Okay.
I can
Well,
tell you after.
yeah, let's do that one. Let's do that one a little later. So, you always disclose. I mean, you always disclose to the other side at initial contact. Okay. But typically, the way that it goes is buyer to seller. Right, because you're interested in their property. Okay. All right. Termination of agency. Termination of agency. Full performance. That's what you want. Remember, this is agency. Death of the owner or an agent acting alone. If you work for a firm and there's a whole bunch of people there and you die, oh well. The firm goes on, somebody else gets your deal, right? Destruction of the property, it blows away, it burns down. Breach of contract. Mutual agreement, things are not working out, we're going to get a divorce. Okay? Or dissolution of the brokerage firm. That means the death of the firm. The firm goes away. Okay? So remember agency. Termination of agency does all those things. All right, next thing you got to know is you got to know the elements of a contract. Okay? You got to have legally competent parties. You got to have a legal objective. You can't do it for things that are illegal. You have to have mutual assent. It's agreement, meeting of the minds, come together on the terms, right? And there must be some type of consideration. Doesn't have to be money, it could be love, affection, but there needs to be some type of consideration. Okay? Now, you need to know the difference between void and voidable and valid. All right? So, a valid contract is binding on all parties, and it's enforceable. You've got all those four elements. Okay, they're there. If it's a void contract, it is definitely missing one of those things. So, the most common way that you have a void contract is that one of the people who is contracting has been declared legally incompetent by a court of law. They don't have the legal capacity to contract. That's the most common way that you see a void contract. Right? That's the way they're going to test you about it. Voidable, right? You've not been declared legally incompetent by a court of law, but you got super drunk when you signed. All right? That's one of the ways that can happen. Or like we say in my class, you got smoked up, all right, and you signed it. Right? You were temporarily insane, something like that was happening. All right? Then it's voidable. Or if you're a minor, it's voidable, and it's voidable by the party. Okay? So if you're the minor, you can void it. The other person can't, but you can, because you're the affected party. If you're the person who got drunk and smoked up, you can void it. Okay? Not the other party, because you were not in your right mind when you did it. Okay? If you were under duress, somebody's holding a gun to your head, okay, you can void it. If somebody said either you sign this or I'm going to fire you, undue influence, you can void it. It's voidable then. Okay? Does that make sense? And then unenforceable is valid, but you can't enforce it. So if I come and I'm say, I want to sell you my 2020 Subaru Forester for $5, you want to buy it?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. Could I do that? Yes. If I didn't do it, could he enforce it in a court of law? No, because it's not in writing. Okay? Make sense? Cool?
A void contract would be something like someone that's not competent to make those decisions.
That's right. They have Alzheimer's or something like that, and they have been medically diagnosed with that. Yep. Miscellaneous things you need to know about contracts. Unilateral. What's an example of a unilateral contract? An option. Okay. One party, and they're going to ask you a question about options most probably. Okay. One party is obligated to perform. The seller is obligated to sell if the buyer executes the option. Bilateral, that's our normal offer to purchase. Both parties are obligated to perform. Executed means that we've done it to completion. It has been fully executed. Executory, we're in process. We're under contract, but we hadn't closed yet. Then that contract that's executory. Once we've closed, it's executed. Remember the statute of frauds. Statute of frauds will be on there. So real estate contracts and leases over 3 years from the time of their making must be in writing and signed by the participating parties in order to be enforceable. That's just the definition. That is what the statute of frauds says. Okay? So you typically have a question about the statute of frauds on the North Carolina part, right? Because this is North Carolina statute of fraud. I think it comes on the North Carolina part. Yeah.
Real estate contracts have to be
In writing and signed by both parties to be enforceable.
right. Okay, that 3 year has nothing to do. I know.
3 years leases from the time of their making.
Okay.
Yes. How long do you have to keep your transaction records? 3 years. How long do you have to deliver documents? 3 days. Yeah, everything's threes. There used to be 3s and 5s, and now everything's 3s. Okay, so that's good. That makes it easy. The only thing that's got all the 5s in it is timeshares. Right? They're all the rules of 5. Condos, how long do you have to rescind that? 7. Very good. Termination contracts, this is what you want, full performance or partial performance. Now, partial and substantial, they're pretty much about the same thing. They're just like different degrees of the same thing. Partial performance, it wasn't what you thought it was going to be, but enough of it was done to go through with it. Substantial performance, maybe you thought you were going to have a bay window and you ended up without one, but you're still going to purchase the house. You know, it's new construction. That's an example of substantial. Impossibility of performance, place blew up, burned down, something like that, blew away. Mutual agreement, right? You can terminate a contract, mutual agreement, or operation of law. You go into bankruptcy. Okay, so those are all the ways that you can terminate contracts. You hope you're going to get one of these, full, partial, or substantial, because that's when you get paid, right? That's what we hope, because that's when we get paid. All right, breach of contract. You do need to know what happens if you breach. If the buyer breaches, the sole remedy for breach of contract is the earnest money deposit, and that's called liquidated damages. You need to know that. Okay? The seller also keeps the due diligence fee, but that's part of the due diligence period and not a remedy for breach. Because that due diligence period is the same kind of thing as an option period, right? You're just evaluating to see if you're going to go forward. Once you go forward, that's when you can breach. And that's when that earnest money deposit comes in. Okay? If the seller breaches, you get everything back. You get your due diligence back, get your earnest money back, get the appraisal fee, the survey fee, anything that you've spent, you get back. Or you can sue the seller for specific performance and make them sell you the house. Okay? Does that make sense? And then consequential damages, just so you know, okay, is damages paid for possible lost gains on top of your compensatory or other damages. So you get all your stuff back to make you whole, that's compensatory, but if you also lost gains, you could also get consequential damages. Okay. Alrighty, so you got to know this part. When do you have a contract? There'll be a scenario, it'll be this long. And this person will do this, and this person will do this, and they'll go here, and they'll go here, and they'll go there, and they'll go there, and this will happen. They'll stick it in the mail, and they'll call them by the phone. And when did you go under contract, or do you have one? That will be on there a lot. Okay? So remember, acceptance of the offer, signing of the contract is a must. It has to be signed, and then it has to be communicated back on the other side. And that could be by in person, phone, email, fax, text, smoke signal, carrier pigeon, right? Those kinds of things. Or by the mailbox rule. And the mailbox rule means as soon as you stick it in the mail and you close the little thing closes, right? It's gone. It's gone. But what they like to ask you is, they'll give you that whole thing with the mailbox rule, and they'll say you mailed it back to your agent. Are you under contract then? No. You mailed it to the seller. Now are you under? Yes. So watch for that, all right? Because they'll be real specific on that one. In fact, I remember taking the test and they had one of those questions and I remember going, dang, that's a good question. It was a good question. I hope I got it right, but it was a good question. Okay. Leasehold, just very briefly on leasehold estates. Tenancy for years. Okay, that's what you've got their definite end time. So you rent the beach house for a week in the summer. That's estate for years or tenancy for years. Seems kind of odd, but that's the way it is. Estate from period to period or periodic tenancy, auto-renews without an ending date. So that's your typical week-to-week lease, month-to-month, or year-to-year. And if it's week-to-week, you have to give 2 days notice to end it. If it's month-to-month, 7 days notice. And if it's year-to-year, it's 1 month notice. Okay. So a typical residential lease starts out as this, right? You've got your 1 year first, and then it goes period to period. Estate at will, indefinite term, and with the landlord's consent. Hey, I got a place in the mountains I'm not using. You want to go live there for a while? Absolutely. As soon as I say, well, guess what? I got to live there now. You got to get out. And you go like, oh, no, I don't want to leave. I'm like, sorry, you got to get out. I'm not leaving. Then you become estate at sufferance. You're held over after the lease expires or after I've told you to get out. Okay? And then you have to go through what to get them out? It's eviction, also known as, what's the other name for eviction? Actual eviction. What's the other name for it? Summary ejectment. Summary ejectment and actual eviction. We hadn't talked about that yet. Okay.
Can you give us a second on that slide?
Yep. Summary ejectment. Actual eviction, summary ejectment. Mm-hmm. Now, if you leave because the landlord has not fixed your heat and it's 25 degrees outside every single day and you've told him about it for a month, what's that called? Constructive eviction. Do you have to keep paying your rent until you leave? Yes. Cool. Good. Lease types. They're going to ask you something about lease types. Okay. We know fixed, sometimes called a gross lease, I think. Tenant pays a fixed amount, no property charges. We know about that. Percentage lease, they pay a fixed amount and a percentage of income. That's like Eddie Bauer. Like a store, retail stores typically have that kind of lease. They got a fixed amount and then a percentage of their profits over a certain number. Okay, so think about that. A net lease, the tenant pays a fixed amount and some of the property charges. Maybe they got to pay the utilities or they got to pay, some things like they got to pay some of the property charges. Maybe the HOA fees, something like that. Graduated, you get to pay this amount here, and then it gets a little bit more, and then it gets a little more, something like that over time. So it increases over time. A ground lease, you're renting the land, and then you build on it. So that's your ground lease. A lot of those are 99 years. 99 years. And then you got your full service lease. Everything's included. Everything. I've got somebody doing that right now. They're doing executive rentals. They have a full service lease. Everything's included, even the furniture. So you rent it like it's, cable is included, utilities, all that kind of stuff. All you have to do is bring your clothes and your food, and you're good to go. Deeds. General warranty deed, that's the kind you want, right? That guarantees it forever, or 30 years, because that's as far back as they check. Right? Limited warranty deed, that's where you're guaranteeing it for only the time that you owned it. Only the time that you owned it. And then remember, the quick claim is usually used to clear up a cloud on title, right? Or like two people are getting divorced and they got to sell the house. One spouse will quick claim the title over to the other one so they can sell it, and then how the proceeds are split is determined in the separation agreement, typically. Okay.
And a foreclosure is like a quick claim deed?
No, foreclosure is not a quick claim deed. So foreclosure, you might be getting a trustee's deed.
That's right.
Yeah, giving it a foreclosure. All right, zoning. Non-conforming. What's non-conforming? Who remembers? Non-conforming, real quick. Yeah, it's grandfathered in. So it was a gas station. Now the whole place is residential. You can still run your gas station, But when you sell it, can they run a gas station? Maybe, probably not. But can they update it? No. The ultimate goal is to get it back to where it's conforming. Okay? Don't confuse that with a variance. What's a variance? Right. The setbacks are supposed to be 50 feet. You get permission to make it 40 feet. Right? It's a variance so that you can build your house and still have your septic tank in. Something like that is a variance. Okay? What's a conditional use? Dum 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 dum.
Churches?
Dum 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 dum. Who's got their book?
It's like if you have a church, it has to be used for that particular condition.
Look it up. Look it up. Conditional use, zoning, conditional use. We're getting towards math now, so I got to get everybody waked back up again.
Is that the one where it's because undue hardship, or that's variance?
Variance is undue hardship. So look it up.
Good. Good, no permission allowing, inconsistent work zoning, public interest.
Right. So let's say everything is residential. So here's your conditional use. Everybody find it? Did you find it? Yeah. So we've got everything's residential. I had a friend. She lived in this huge development in Houston, Texas. The entire thing was residential. In the middle of it was a school. And so all of the kids from that development went to that school. Okay? That would be conditional use. Okay? It's not conforming to everything else, but it's in the public interest. Right? So just kind of remember that. Remember that. That's when people typically forget. That's why I wanted you to look it up real fast, because now you'll remember it. Okay? Easements, you need to know who's dominant and who's servient. The dominant's the person that gets to do it. The servient's the person providing it. Okay? I get to drive over your driveway to get to my house. Okay? I'm the dominant. You're allowing me to drive over your driveway. You're the servient. Okay? Remember that. Condos and townhouses. So, condos are typically horizontally stacked. Townhouses are typically vertically stacked, right? But the townhouses are horizontally connected. Okay, so remember that. Condo, you only own the airspace. You own the common areas with the other owners as tenants in common. Remember that. In a townhouse, you own the land, and the HOA owns the common areas. So the difference between a condo and a townhouse will be on the test. Okay, and you've got to know those characteristics. Yes?
Another name for townhouse is row house.
Row house is another name for townhouse. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Kind of threw me on this comment.
Yeah. You can call it a row house. Mm-hmm.
You think we'll see that terminology right now? Okay.
Row house, yes. You might see it, but typically they'll say townhouse. But another name for a townhouse is a row house. Not road, but row. Okay? And then, in a co-op, you own shares of stock that give you a proprietary lease. So remember that. So there will be questions. There's at least one or two questions on the test about those things. Okay? Liens. Remember the difference between a general lien goes on everything versus a specific lien, which is your property taxes. That's on your property. So here's a question for you. The house, if the property is foreclosed on, what gets paid first?
Well, then, yeah, the lawyers get paid first.
The attorney gets paid first. Then the taxes, right? And then the bank. Okay? So I always like to say that to help you remember it, but the attorney actually gets paid first. But then it's taxes and then it's that. But literally the attorney gets paid first. Okay, so for taxes, you need to know the difference between octennial reappraisal required every 8 years, the horizontal adjustment every 4 years, and the ad valorem tax rate is adjusted every year. Don't get those confused. Okay? Ad valorem means per 100. Right? If it's per mil, they'll say mil, and then it's per 1,000. So just remember that when you're doing your math. Okay? Financing, know the difference between lien and title theory. We are a title theory state. Deed of trust. Borrower gets the equitable title. Trustee holds the legal title, okay, until the loan's paid off. And then make sure you know the alienation clause, also known as the due on sale clause. And you know the acceleration clause. So if you're in default, they can accelerate it and call the note due right then. Okay? So those two terms, they like to test you on those two terms. Okay? Environmental issues, we already talked about those, so we're good on those. Fair housing. Fair housing. Y'all know fresh corn? Y'all don't know it yet. Is that how y'all remember fair housing? Protected class. Do y'all know that acronym? Seriously? No, you do not know that one. Okay. So here's how you remember it. You remember the acronym fresh corn. Okay. So the E is for equal, and the O is for opportunity. Okay? And so let's find them. What's the F? Familial status. R is race. What's the S? Sex. What's the H? Okay, what's the C? What? Color. The next R? Religion. And then we have national origin. So that's how you remember those. Okay? Acronym fresh corn is a great way to remember those. O, opportunity, equal opportunity. So the E and the O are equal opportunity, and that's what fair housing is about, equal opportunity. Okay? So the last two that were added were handicap and familial status, right? And they do not apply to financing. What are the things that are in financing instead? Age and marital status. Marital status. Okay, so kind of remember those two swap around. Other things you need to remember, steering. Y'all know what steering is? Trying to get somebody to buy a certain place. Okay? Based on the presence or absence of a protected class. Hey, don't you want to go live with all the other Martians? They're living out in Ardmore. Okay? Blockbusting, encouraging others to sell because of the presence. Ooh, you need to sell. The Martians are moving into Ardmore. All right? And they're a protected class, if they were a protected class. And then redlining, lenders not lending in a certain area. We do not lend where the Martians are. So that's what redlining is. Don't worry, we'll get to that. Well, yeah. Okay. So equal opportunity, protected classes right here. So race, there's same here, race, color, religion, national origin, sex, but then there's age and marital status. And also if you get public assistance income, they cannot negate that from you. Okay? So that's just a quick review of that. Insurance, gotta need to know, there's gonna be probably like one question on that. Remember we have the clue report, looks at the last 7 years. Okay, comprehensive loss underwriting exchange report. You evaluate the cost during the DDP. You maintain coverage until closing, if you're the seller. Okay. Flood insurance is separate and administered by FEMA. Many times a lender will require you to have flood insurance if you're in a floodplain. Okay, if you've ever gotten public assistance, you have to have flood insurance then if you ever want to get it again, because of a flood, those kinds of things. HO3 is residential, HO4 is rental, HO6 is the condo. Those are your most common policies.
Do we need to know the 3, 4, and 6?
I would. I just know the 3, that's because they're your most common policies. Know that the 4 is renter, the 6 is condo, and the 3 is your typical residential. And there are lots of other variations of that, but those are the most common ones. Okay? All right, let's do some math. All right, so what kind of math do you need to know how to do for the test? This is what you need to know. You need to know how to calculate area, commissions, minimum sales price. You got to calculate and prorate taxes and fees. Multiple times. Interim interest, cash from the buyer or due to the seller. Origination fees and discount points. Yep. Principal and interest. And then the cost approach. Cost approach, okay, are the most common things that you need to know. And then calculating net operating expenses, kind of those kinds of things, net operating expenses. We'll talk about that as well. Okay, so that's another one in there. Those are the most common ones. There are 10 of them. Now they've added a new one back. They've added a new one back called qualifying the buyer. Qualifying the buyer. And we'll do one of those today because that's new. And actually, I'm not sure if it's this test or the next test, but we want to make sure that we've got it. And so we'll do one qualifying the buyer. So remember your formulas. You need to know length times width for square footage. Y'all probably got that down by now. The triangle, one of the things in the book, there used to be an error. They used to not have the parentheses here. So it was 1/2 base times height, but it should be 1/2 base times height and then 1/2 of that. Okay? And then acres, 43,560, remember that. They will probably ask you that and give you different iterations of that number. So if you need to remember, what is it, the 4 blue hairs going 35 and a 60, or Richard Petty, if Richard Petty, which is 43, went 56 miles an hour, how many races would he win? 0. Okay, so whatever helps you remember that. Just make sure you remember that. Because they might give you 43,560, 46,530, that kind of thing. Rectangular survey, what do you need to know about that? You don't have to do any of the math for that, but you do need to know 640 acres in a section. You need to know your meridians and your baselines, which way they run. Okay? You need to know that how it's numbered. Like it starts on here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You need to know that. You need to know section 16 is the school section, and that you can multiply the fractions and then divide into 640. But you won't have to, there's not rectangular survey math, okay? Typically. You never say never, but I wouldn't worry about that. If there's rectangular survey math, that's the only one you missed, hey, you got all but one right, you got a 99 point something percent, you're good. Alrighty, so let's do some commission problems. Here's a commission problem. Everybody get out their calculators, get out their paper. Let's do the commission problem, and then we'll see how well we do. And this is how it's going to be. It'll be like several different pieces to it, because if they can test you on multiple things at one time, they definitely will. So when you're doing these problems, I always recommend that you write down all of your steps. Don't just start punching things in the calculator. It's a really easy way to make a careless mistake, so write down each bit of it. Okay? So let's see what we got here. So 5% of the first 100,000, 5,000. Feel free to take pictures of these slides if you want to, since they've got the math worked out. 6% of the next 100,000, right? And then the tricky part here, 7% of 135,300. So it's the sales price that's important, not the list price, so they throw a distractor in there. Make sure you don't get bitten by the distractor bug. You add all these up, 20,471. Good? Sound cool? Good with that? Let's do another one. Now here's the other kind they like to give you, where you got all the different who gets what and how much is the split and all that kind of stuff. So let's work on that one. Remember to read your question first, then go back through your scenario. Save you some time. All right, so what are some distractors in this problem? Do you really need to know the 6%? 6% and 2.5%. Yeah, 6% and 2.5%. You really don't need to know either one of those, because they're only asking about the selling agent, right? Which is the 3.5% and the 60% of that. So did you get 4,095? Cool. Okay. So if you worked out the whole thing, you'd kind of just be wasting a little time. It's not bad, but you don't need to, because all you need to know is the 3.5% and the 60% split of that to get your steps. Good with that? Anybody need to see that one worked out? Good? All right, cool. All right, so to calculate the appropriate selling price, so the seller will receive a certain amount of money after paying closing costs and sales commission, remember the formula. The selling price is equal to the seller's net plus the closing cost divided by 100% minus your commission percentage. All right? So this is like the net, this is like, what does the selling price need to be? That's what you're trying to figure out there.
Say that again, please.
Yes, you're trying to figure out what's the selling price. So when you've got a problem that you know that the seller's like, okay, I want to list my house. I've got to get $50,000 so I can buy another house. I owe $150,000. What are my closing costs going to be? You say, well, your closing costs are going to be $8,000. And I'm like, okay, after I do all that and I pay your commission, what's the price I'm going to need to sell the house for in order to get that money? So that's the discussion that you're having with that seller. Okay? So the way that this typically looks, if we think about it the other way, see, we're used to thinking about the price. Okay, so you're used to figuring the price, times the commission, we'll say 6%, right? And then you get that number, right? And then you take the price and you subtract, we'll call this commission, okay? We subtract the commission, and then you get the amount that the seller has left over, right? That's what they get after that. Then what do they got to pay? They got to pay their loan. They got to pay closing cost. Okay? And then they got to have some amount that they walk away with. Okay? So we kind of think about it like that's the steps that we think about. So this is, if you know all of these things, how do you get this? That's what we're doing. So we're kind of doing it in reverse there. Okay? So let's actually look at one, and then we'll walk through this one step by step. So the way I like to work out this problem is that, just so you'll see, I got my loan amount over here, plus my closing costs, I'm going to call that CC, plus the amount I want to walk away with, amount walk, okay? All right, so that is going to be equal to, that's equal to some percentage, okay, of whatever my price is. This is going to be my price over here. Okay. So we know this is the commission part here, right? But this is not 6% of that. This is, if my commission is 6%, then this number here is actually 94% of that number, right? Because if I'm going the other way, this 6% I kind of get back. So this is 94% of that. So this is always 100% minus the commission, which in this case, if the commission is 6%, then it becomes 94, right? 94 or 0.94. So whatever this number ends up being, I divide by 0.94 to get that price. Okay? So let's try that, see how we do. This is like my favorite problem in the world, and but it's a really tricky one. And it's one where a T-bar is kind of is an odd, it's kind of, you can do it with the T-bar, but so if you like the T-bar, right, then this number right here goes on the top, okay, and then this here goes down here, and the price is there. So if you want to put this out on the T-bar, all of this total here, which is the part, this is the part, and then this is the rate, right, if you're doing the T-bar, and this is the whole. So the whole is always the biggest number. That's what I'm looking for here. Here's my rate, which is this, and the part is all this stuff over here. So if you use the T-bar, think about it like this. Okay? And let's try that one. Yeah, this is just an example. This is just an example, okay, and how you would set it up. That's the actual problem. All right, so here we go. Here's our formula again, okay? So we have 100,000, which is what she wants to net. Okay, and the closing costs are going to be $8,000. Then we divide that by 100% minus the commission rate, right, which is 108 divided by 90%, which equals 120,000. Got it? See how we did it? Okay. So sometimes you have one of those on the test. There's typically like one of those on the test. Lots of times you have one of those. I really like those. That's like one of my favorite ones to do. Alrighty, so let's say we're going to determine the value of a property using the cost appreciation approach. Cost appreciation. It's a two-step math process. It's interesting how you do it, but it's a two-step process. So step one is you figure out the depreciation, which is the reproduction cost divided by the economic life times the effective age, and that gets your total depreciation. So let's say that you have a reproduction cost of $200,000, okay, and it has an economic life of 20 years, okay, and you're 5 years in. Okay, so if we did that, 20,000 divided by 20 would be what? 10,000, okay, times 5, 50,000. So your total depreciation is 50,000. Okay, you got it? So that's 50K. All right. And then you take the reproduction cost, all right, and you subtract your depreciation. So this is what your accountant does on your taxes, right? Minus 50,000. Okay, so we've got 150,000. And then you add back in, because you took it out up here, right? You did the value of the land. So why do you not depreciate the value of the land? Land cannot depreciate. It cannot depreciate. So we got to put the land value in here. So if the land value is up here, first of all, you got to take it out, okay? But usually they just tell it to you separately. And then you got to remember to add it back in, and then you get your depreciated value of the property. So that's kind of how that works out. So let's do 1 and see what we get. So step 1, 300,000 divided by 20, and then times 4 gives us 60,000. We take the 60,000 away from the 300,000 and we add the land value back in, and you get 280,000. Good with that? Cool. Cool. That's great. So the income capitalization approach, I is net operating income, R is the capitalization rate, V is value. When you know the value of two of the letters, you can determine the third by either dividing or multiplying, right? So this is our formula. I is equal to RV. Okay? I is equal to RV. So if we've got I equals RV, if I wanted to put that in the T-bar, it'd be like that, okay? So whichever way floats your boat, that's the formula. So let's figure out one. If the net operating income is 40,000, the cap rate's 10%, what's the value of the property? Did you get it? 400,000? Yeah, so 40,000 divided by 10%, 400,000. All right, let's do some discount points. Okay, so this is a two-part question here. Okay, we've got discount points. So we want to know how much will the points cost, and then what's the yield to the lender? Two separate questions, okay? We're going to look at discount, how much the points cost first, and then we'll do yield to the lender. Okay, so give that one a whirl. Hopefully this is review. Now, if anything's not review, we need to go into detail, let me know, we'll go into detail. So far, everybody seems to be on track. All right, so let's take a look at this. So, everybody get the cost of the points? Yeah, that's easy. All right. Each point is what percentage of the rate? An eighth, right? So if we have 4, what's 4/8? A half, okay? So 4 points adds 4/8 or 1/2% to the lender's yield. Very simple.
Oh, that's what it was at.
No, they don't tell you. So the rate's 7%, right? The lender's charging 4 discount points. So what's their actual yield on this is 7.5. So they pay the 4 discount points to get it down to 7%.
Okay.
Okay?
Got it.
So yeah, so it's 7.5. So that it adds that to the lender's yield, so it makes it 7.5. Okay, to amortize a loan. Loan amount times annual interest rate divided by 12 gives you the monthly interest. The mortgage payment minus the monthly interest is the principal portion, and then the principal balance minus the principal portion is the new loan balance. Y'all remember doing one of those? So let's do the deep dive, and let's figure out that. So the first part, here we go. 80,000 times 8%, $6,400 annual interest, right? Divided by 12, 533 monthly interest. Okay? 587.01, which is your principal and interest, minus 533.33 tells you that your principal payment was $53.68. So if you take 80,000, subtract that $53.68, your new principal balance is $79,946.32. Now just for fun, I did a second one. Took it out to the principal balance after the new payment. So you see how you would continue to do it down. So just for fun, we did the second month. Did y'all talk about qualifying a buyer? Have y'all done that? Okay. So if you're qualifying your buyer, okay, the mortgage payment cannot exceed 28%, okay, of their gross income, monthly income. All right. So this is my housing expense here, all right, cannot exceed 28%. And my 36% is my housing expense plus my recurring debt cannot exceed 36. And you have to qualify under both, right, to get your loan.
And then which one do you pick, the lower one?
Okay, so let's say that, yeah, whichever one is less is the amount that you qualify for, okay? So just keep that in mind, all right? So so let's kind of look at it this way. Let's say that your combined monthly gross income is $6,000, okay? How much could your housing expense be? What? $1,680. Okay, all right. So, everybody cool with that? You're kind of cool with that? All right. So that's all right. So now let's look at kind of like a little bit of a different scenario. Let's say that you're I'm trying to make up examples on the fly. It's kind of tricky. So let's say that you've got here's your credit card, monthly recurring is $250, and then you got a car payment. Okay, and your car payment is $500. Okay, and so if you knew, and your income is $6,000. Okay, how would you figure out if they could afford this house or not? If they could afford that payment or not? What would you do next? What would you do next? So you're gonna take 36% of your $6,000, and what is that number? 2,000 who? 2,160. Okay. Then I got to subtract out my recurrings, right? So I got to subtract my 500 and subtract my 250, which is really subtracting 750. And what number do I get with that? 1,410. Okay. So, which payment can I afford then? Which is going to be my max for my housing expense? The lower of the two. Okay? And that's what you need to know. That's what you need to know. So when I do it this way, I get this number. Okay? When I do all of this, I get this number. So that's the maximum housing expense that I can afford. Principal, interest, taxes, insurance, HOA fees, all the things that they fit into that, that's what that's going to be.
Now, how did you get the 2160?
36% of my income, $6,000.
Okay.
Okay? So I got to get that 36% first. Then I got to subtract out my recurrings to get to what my maximum housing expense would be there. Okay?
Doesn't that seem like that's always the lower one then?
When you're looking at recurrings, typically, yes, it is. Typically, yes, it is. Okay? But there are instances where you need to figure out both because of the way that they're. So one of the things they're going to ask is they'll give you a number, and they'll say, do they qualify with this one, or both? Okay, so sometimes they'll give you a scenario, and they'll ask you based on that scenario, and I can't think of one off the top of my head. I would not make up the numbers right. Do they qualify here, or both? So it may say they qualify under 1 only, 2 only, 1 and 2, neither 1 and 2. That's going to be your question, because that's what they like to do, that A and B, or neither A and B. Okay? So as long as you know how to do this, you'll be able to answer the question. Okay? And that's a brand new thing they're just adding into the test. So it's not really it's not even in the book anymore, I don't think.
Is it 28% and the 36%?
28 and 36.
Do they have like a names for which one?
So 28 and 36 are your qualifying. This is your housing expense like qualifying, and then this is your total amount, total expense qualifying ratio. And these are the typical numbers for conventional loans. They can vary depending upon the loan. So FHA has higher numbers than that. Okay? But this is the typical one that they'll give you, and they'll give you the numbers. They'll give you the numbers. Alrighty, let's look at another problem. Prorate the taxes. You will definitely be prorating stuff. You might prorate rent, you might prorate taxes, you might prorate HOA fees. You will definitely be prorating stuff. So let's do a proration. You're figuring out exactly how it's going to appear on the form. And I think for this one, there's one of them you got to use the 365-day calendar. I can't remember which one it is. Is it this one? This one. Use like the real days of the year. Okay, except it's not 2020, it's not leap year. All right, so use a 365-day calendar, not a 360.
But now on the test, will we use a 360 calendar?
360 for pre, 365 for post. They provide you with the information, so you'll know which one to use. But to get this answer right, this happens to be a 365, okay, because we're advanced here. We know how many days there are in each month, right? So the only thing that changes is the actual, number of days. Everything else is done the same, right? All right, so with this one, you calculate the number of days between January 1st and March 14th. There are 31 days in January, 28 in February, 14 in March, so that's 73 days. Okay? Now, if you did it the other way, you would have 30 and 30 and 14, so you would have 30 and 30 is 60 and 14. You would have 74 days, so you'd have 1 day off. Okay? All right. So, calculate, now on the test, they will give you the difference between 1 day because they're making sure you know who owns the day of closing, right? So be aware of that. Calculate the daily tax rate by dividing annual taxes by 365. I don't round. I don't round to the very end. If you're going to round, you got to go at least three places past the decimal. Okay? And then when you figure it out, multiply the daily tax rate by the number of days. Okay? So you get 440. Now, here's what my little chart's for. Okay? If it's March 14th, have the taxes been paid yet? No. Tax bill hadn't even come out yet, right? So who's going to be paying the taxes? The buyer's going to be paying them later. The buyer's going to be paying them later. Okay? So this is the way I do every single problem. I start with January. I go to December. I draw out when my closing date is. Okay? I know the seller owns up to closing. The buyer owns after closing. Okay? They told me it's March 14th. Taxes have not been paid yet. So the seller's got to give the buyer the money to pay the taxes later. Right? So this is going to be debit seller, credit buyer, whatever we got, 440. Does that make sense? Drawing out this little chart, you'll never miss one if you draw this chart. Okay? In fact, if you can draw this chart, You can do the next problem without touching your calculator. Okay, so here's my problem. Cellular residence is scheduled to close on April the 18th. The taxes are $2,400 and have been prepaid. Prorations include the day of closing. What entries should be made on the closing statement? And they're going to give you multiple choice. All right, so don't do the math. Don't do the math. Let's see if we can figure this out. So, what did they tell us here? Closing is April the 18th. Yeah, that's still pretty close. So I don't have to draw. I don't have to change this line. 418. But what else did they say? Have the taxes already been paid? Yes. So if they've already been paid, who has to give money to whom? The buyer has to give money to the seller. Okay. Which number's bigger? The buyer's amount or the seller's amount? The buyer's amount. Okay. So we're going to look at debit buyer, credit seller, a big number, right? Correct? Okay. So if you know that, you don't even have to do math to figure this out. Because here's my little number, here's my big number, right? So all I have to know is credit seller, debit buyer, the bigger number. Don't even have to do math because it's all logical based on this, right? They give you that multiple choice. Does that make sense? So you might have a math problem. You don't even have to do math to answer. That's pretty cool. All right, this is going to be the one we're going to do at the last. This is hard. All right, so a couple things I want to remind you of. We still got a couple more math problems to do, but I want to remind you of this one first. Remind you of a couple things first. And then we got that one is like the big one. We usually don't even have time to do it, but I've got you the answers, so you can take a picture of it. So in comparative market analysis, remember, never adjust the subject property. You don't have CMA problems anymore. We used to have. When I took the test, we had a CMA problem because it was on the state and they took them off. Remember CIA, comp inferior add. The comp's inferior you add. CBS, comp better subtract. Anytime you're doing it or you have to think about one, they give you write those things down, you'll never miss it. You'll never miss it. So remember that. Okay, the income approach. You've got to know about poor Violet. So poor Violet eats Oreos, not dog biscuits. Okay? This is how you figure out your stuff with net operating income or net income. Okay? So poor is potential gross income. Violet is your vacancy rate. Okay? E is your effective gross income. O, operating expenses. N, net operating income. D, debt service. B, before tax cash flow. So they give you problems with, they'll tell you the vacancy rate, they'll tell you the operating expenses, you got to figure out the net operating income, that kind of thing. Have y'all done some problems like that? Y'all haven't, but did y'all do that yet? Maybe y'all do that this weekend. Okay, you'll probably do it this weekend. Okay, so remember, poor Violet eats Oreos, not dog biscuits. Okay, and then all you do is plug in the numbers that they give you. So let's look at this. So what are they looking for? Net operating income. So they're looking for this number right here, right? They're looking for that. What do we know? So do we know the potential gross income? No, we do not. Do we know the vacancy rate? Yes. We know the vacancy rate is 3%. You're right. Do we know the effective gross income? Yes. What is that? 300,000. Okay. Do we know the operating expenses? 40,000. Operating expenses? 175,000. Okay. And the debt service? 40,000. Okay. But we're looking for this, right? So if we're looking for this, does this matter? No, that's a distractor. If they've already given us the effective gross income, does that matter? That's a distractor. So if you subtract these two things out, this is a super simple problem. Right? 125. Watch for your distractors. So we didn't even do most of this stuff, right? All right, now the last problem that we have, we're just about out of time. We've got like 3 minutes. This one is how much cash does the buyer need to close? So with this, you've got your buyer. You will have one of these on the test. Okay? And you just draw a little chart. And over here you put credits. And over here you put debits. And then you fill in each one of these numbers as you go down. Okay? So, they made a $1,000 EMD. Is that a credit or a debit? It's a credit. They made a $50 due diligence. Credit or debit? $50 due diligence is your credit. The sales price is $120. That's a debit, right? Because I got to pay that out. So you kind of see how we do this. We don't have enough time. This will take 20 minutes to do, and we're just about out of time. So I wanted to get you started and show you the answer so that you can take a picture of it and then practice this one at home. It's called, yeah, it's in 21, but it's net to seller or cash from buyer to close. Yep. Okay. So you take a picture of this to make sure you've got that to practice with. You've got your additional math problems at the end of the test and the answers worked out on the answer sheet that I gave you. Okay. Anybody have any questions about anything burning that you just need to know that you think you're going to fail if I don't tell you the answer right now? If you're checking down and there's like 4 of the same letter in a row and you think, oh, that can't be, yes, it can be. Okay, so don't let that throw you. All right. Cool. Thank you for coming. I hope you found it helpful. Yeah.